Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to do the dry build on the Volvo cab. So no paint and in general no glue. But we will be building it up so we know everything fits. We're up to step 62 in the build and Tamiya want us to prep and paint the main part of the cab. We're not going to follow the build to the letter, so all we're going to be doing is remove the bits of the sprue from the windscreen and the hole in the top of the roof. We're just going to use some side cutters to cut them free, and before we paint it all, when we're wet sanding the body, we'll also smooth out any rough bits that's left over. Step 63, the side mirrors. We're going to need some screws, so we're going to open up bag H and decant all the small parts into some pudding pots as usual. We've got a couple of bags of small screws, some loose long screws and the metal plate for the front of the cab. To put the mirror assemblies together, we're going to need K11 and 12, the arms, L8, 9, 12 and 13, the mirror holders, 4 M2x4 screws, and easy to miss, we need the two lower mounts, T14 and 15. To assemble, first we need to attach the mirror holders to the arms. They stay in place with a small screw and are located with a nice keyed boss. So when you offer them up, turn them a little until they drop into place. Of course, the usual advice applies. These small screws don't need to be done up very tight at all. Just bottom them out. If you do over tighten them, you're going to strip the thread before you know where you are. Next we slot the bottom of the arm into its mount and press it into place. It should go in with a good nice snap. Rinse and repeat, and that's the two mirror assemblies ready to go. Step 64, windows, mirrors and the trailer hole plug. We're going to need S5 and 6, the front windows. Now it's worth noting that these need a little bit of paint to black out around the bottom and front edges. Tamiya show you where to paint by giving the sections a matte finish. Masking them up is still going to be tricky, but so much easier than trying to make it up as you go along. For screws we need 6 M2x8 cap heads, 6 M2 plain nuts, T12 and 13 the top mirror mounts, and when we get to it we also need H1 the trailer hole plug. The windows sit in the cab in the window aperture, then on the outside we offer up the mirror assembly and pop in one of the screws. As long as you're careful, it's just enough to keep all the bits in position. Next we need to use the included nut driver, part D5, to spin the nut onto the screw. Then we do the same with the other bottom screw, followed by the top mount and its screw. The provided nut driver is pretty handy. You don't get a lot of grip on it, making it just about impossible to over tighten the screws. The trick is, if you do over tighten it, you can crack the window plastic, so you have to be a bit careful. Tamiya also recommend using thread lock, but again you have to be careful with it, this time because it can cause a problem with the plastic, making it brittle. Later in the build, once it's all painted, we're going to put a spot of poly cement on the screw threads just behind the nut. It's a bit safer and will be more than good enough for the mirrors. With the nuts, if you want to nip them up just a little bit more, you can, using a nut driver with a bit more grip. Just keep in mind you don't want to squash the plastics, just take up the slack. Rinse and repeat on the other side and we can move on to the trailer plug hole. Now, on a truck that tows a trailer, when using a Tamiya MFC and the wired trailer light kit, you'd install the mini DIN connector in the hole. But we won't be towing a trailer with this truck, so we need to install the H1 plug. Tamiya used double-sided tape, but I think I'd go for Plastic-Weld to make it permanent before painting. When building, I actually didn't fit the plug, but I can't remember why. It doesn't matter too much though, as long as it goes on before paint, it's all good. Step 65, windscreen and cab mount. We're going to need G3 the rear mount, S4 the windscreen, 2 M2x8s, 4 3x8 self-tappers, 2 2x6 self-tappers and 2 M2 plain nuts. And if the cab was painted we'd also fit the two rear windows S1 and S2, but they get stuck on with double-sided tape. First then, we need to offer up the mount to the inside of the cab and thread in the 4 3mm self-tappers. We'll thread them in a turn or so it's all lined up, then tighten them all up together. A nice simple setup that should work a treat. We don't get the tilting cab, but that's okay. Anything that needs regular fiddling with is going to be mounted further back behind the doors. The windscreen drops into place from the inside. Now it has to be in just the right spot to fall into place, so don't be tempted to force it in. When it's just so, it'll fall in with no effort. Then at the top we use the two 2x8s and the plain nuts. It doesn't really matter which way up you install them, just don't do them up too tight. For now we'll only take up the slack until the bottom screws are in too. The bottom screws are the small self-tappers. They go in through the front and thread directly into the windscreen. The heads end up being covered with a pair of glue-on handles, so it all looks nice and scale. Once the bottom screws are snug, we can go back to the top pair and nip them up too. Next, if it was all painted, we'd stick in the rear windows and glue on the door handles. Step 66, the roof front. Tamiya have nicely split this step up into two versions, one without an MFC and one with an MFC. The only difference being with the MFC we have some LEDs to install, otherwise they're identical. We'll run through it with the MFC version since they're otherwise exactly the same. If you don't have an MFC, just leave out the LEDs. Right, we're going to need M2, the roof front, N13 and 14, the light buckets, AA5 and 6, the lenses, 4 T1 LED clips, and we're going to need some LEDs from the MFC kit. Each one is color coded so we can work out which one we need. The manual says we want J15 and J16. If we look at the MFC manual and look up 15 and 16, we see we need a white-green for J15 and a white-blue for J16, which makes things nice and simple. As long as you read all the captions carefully, the MFC really is extremely easy to set up. For screws, there's 4 3x8 self-tappers, 4 2x6 self-tappers, 2 M3x12 grub screws, 2 3mm washers, and the 2 T8 plastic brackets. To assemble, first we pop in one of the lenses, which according to Tamiya should be glued in, but we're doing a dry build so no glue, and besides they seem to stay put pretty well as is. Behind the lenses we offer up a light bucket and attach it with a 3x8 self-tapper. You have to hold it fairly firmly until the screw's nice and snug or it will try and fall apart, but once it's in it's all quite stable. Do both sides and we can work on the LEDs. Now this is fairly straightforward, if a little bit awkward. You have to pop an LED into the bucket, offer up the LED clip and thread in one of the 2x6 self-tappers. The problem is the wires on the LEDs will try really hard to remove the LEDs from the buckets before you've got the screw done up. These ones aren't too bad as you can get a finger onto the back of the clips. They're pretty good practice for some of the later light buckets in the front bumper. Install all 4, remembering to get the right ones in the right holes, and we can move on. To install the mounting brackets, we need to take one of the 3x8 self-tappers and pop a washer over the head. Then screw it into the hole a turn or so. The brackets then have a slot that goes over the screw head, plus they're keyed so they'll find their own position, making them nice and straight. Just make sure that when you're doing the screw up, the bracket is all the way in, which just leaves the grub screws. They thread into the last 2 holes and thread in so there's roughly 7mm of thread still exposed. You can measure it, but it's not really that critical. The only thing to keep in mind is if you go too far, the end of the grub screw could go right through and out of the front. You have to go way too far for that to happen though. As an optional thing, I'm also going to run a bit of heat shrink up over the LED wires to keep them held together, hopefully making it a bit less of a rat's nest to keep in check when we fit the roof to the cab. Step 67, fitting the front of the roof to the back of the roof. We need the roof, the 4 standoff spacers, the T21s, and 2 M3 flange nuts. Now there's not too much to this one. We just need to offer up the front of the roof with the rear, slotting the exposed threads from the grub screws into the slots in the rear section and installing the nuts. Access is a little bit limited, but you can just about get the Tamiya cross wrench in, tightening the nut up a little bit at a time. If you struggle, a 5.5mm spanner might be handy. The standoffs are just a push fit onto the 4 posts inside the roof. Nice and simple. Step 68, the roof lamps. Now the kit comes with a rather nice set of plastic roof lights with a bar that fits onto the roof. But we're not going to fit them though, as we've got an even nicer metal set. As well as the spotlights, this set also has 3 LEDs in the bar itself. It's all a bit swish. However, we're not going to fit them just yet, as I've still got to work out how it's all going to get wired up. We'll come back to it later when we've got a bit more serious about all the custom work. Step 69 and another brief encounter. This is where we put together the visor that fits above the windscreen. However, it's all glued and painted, so there's not really much we can do right now. We'll still get the visor itself ready, S7, so it can fit to the cab, clipping it free from the parts tree. Step 70 is yet another one that we're not going to be able to do just yet, fitting the sunroof. It gets stuck to the roof with double-sided tape, and we're probably going to need to cut some slots in the front for the roof wiring too. Step 71, the visor, speaker and air intake. We've got the 2 parts of the intake, T9 and T20. From the MFC kit we need a flat speaker mounting plate and of course the speaker. Now before we get the small screws out from the Wrecker kit, we might as well fit the speaker to the mount. In the MFC manual it uses 4 3x8 self-tappers and washers. These come from the screws bag in the MFC kit, not the Wrecker. Tamiya also want us to use some plastic mesh under the speaker to protect it, but as long as you're careful you don't really need it. And in our case we're going to be replacing the speaker mount with a nicer looking 3D part a little bit later in the build. To mount the speaker we just sit it on the mount and install the screws with the washers in each corner. Nice and simple, and will do the job well enough. Back to the Wrecker manual now, and we need 2 M2x4s, 4 M2x8s, 4 3x25 self-tappers, 2 3x8 self-tappers, 2 2x6 self-tappers, and 4 M2 nuts. To mount the speaker mount when we get to it, we also need 4 3x8 self-tappers. Now it's not clear whether these come from the Wrecker kit or the MFC. But I'm thinking since they're listed in the Wrecker manual, they're going to come from the Wrecker kit. We'll just have to keep in mind just in case we run out later. We can always steal some from the MFC kit to compensate. To put together the airbox, we need to thread in the 2 M2x4s just a turn or so into the holes in the edge of the large section. Then offer up the small part, fitting the slotted holes over the screws. Then we just gently nip them up. There's really not much thread holding them in, so any vague attempt at over tightening is going to strip the threads before you know it. You really do need to be very, very careful. Next we mount the speaker mount. It just sits on top of the cab, lining up with the 4 holes. Then from the inside we screw in 4 3x8 self-tappers. You can see it's really not the nicest looking mount with those gaps along either side, but it works just fine. It just doesn't look great. We'll end up making a nice 3D printed mount that covers the entire hole. Chances are no one's ever going to see it, but it's a nice little detail that makes all the difference to that one person that looks closely at the build. Next up is the visor, which is attached with 4 M2x8s and nuts. All we do is insert the 4 screws up from the inside of the cab and spin on the nut a couple of turns. Then we offer up the visor so it slots under the nuts and we nip up the screws. Again, just like the windows, we don't want to go too tight, just enough to keep it all nice and snug. Once it's all painted and we rebuild, we will add a little bit of poly cement to the threads so they can't vibrate loose, without of course worrying about the thread lock damaging the plastic. Back to the airbox, which sits in a recess on the roof. Then from the bottom we screw in the 2 2x6 self-tappers. Now for the good bit, we need to thread all the wires down the side of the speaker into the cab, then offer the roof up. Hopefully getting the standoffs to sit above the mounting holes. They do have a tendency to get knocked out of line, so have a good look before you start to fit the screws. As for the screws, we need the 2 3x8 self-tappers at the front, screwing into the bracket in the front of the roof section. Then we use the 3x25s to go up through the standoffs. Starting by getting all the screws in, just a couple of turns to make sure everything's lined up, then go around and nip them all up so they're nice and snug. After that we're left with a cab that's really starting to look like something very nice. Step 72, the front panel and air intake. We're going to need T11, the intake, N1, the chrome front panel, 4 M2x5 cap heads, and 3 2x6 self-tappers. The chrome panel sits in the slot at the front of the cab, filling the hole. From the inside we just use the 4 cap heads to attach it. Now the cap heads are really quite clever. If it was your typical JIS head, most screwdrivers would be too long to get a good angle. With the cap heads you can just use a small Allen key from the kit. Next, on the back of the cab we'll offer up the air intake and thread in the 3 self-tappers. And that's about it. A nice simple step. Step 73, dashboard. Now the dashboard's made up of several bits. The dash itself, steering column, wheel and the 2 mounts. But there's lots of paint and glue required, so we're not going to fit it just yet. We are going to fit the screws to the cab though, 2 M3x10s and some flange nuts, just so we know where they are when we come to need them. Step 74, wheel arches and the top grille. Now this is where things get a bit more interesting again. We need K4, the top grille insert, H2 and H3, the wheel arches, and we need to open the little black box that contains the thin metal grills. We're only going to need the smaller upper grille for this step. Later on we're going to replace it with this set that has built-in lights. The grille is also full shiny metal rather than the satin finish of the Tamiya parts. For screws we need 4 1.2 by 2.5 self-tappers. No, that's not backwards, they really are that small. The Tamiya screwdriver works well enough for these, but if you have a tiny screwdriver set you might want to try them to see if you can find one that's an even better fit. Which just leaves the 2 M3x8 cap heads. Starting with the grille, it sits on the front of the cab lining up with the 4 holes. Then we need to thread in the tiny screws. These are the type of screw that if you drop one you're probably never going to see it again, especially building over carpet, so be very careful and methodical. Also, being so small, the difference between being snug and stripped is negligible. After painting there's going to be a bit more meat, but they're still going to be a bit delicate. For now we'll leave them slightly loose so we can drop the insert in and thread in its 2 screws, doing them up nice and snug. Now we can finish tightening up the tiny screws, knowing it's all lined up and nothing's going to get stressed. For the arches we need to stick them onto the cab. Poly cement will work pretty well, but for the ultimate bond we're going to use Plasti-Weld. It literally welds the plastic, melting the surfaces so it all combines. We use some tweezers to pick up some of the Plasti-Weld and apply it to the tab. Get a few drops on and we can fit the arch to the cab, holding it nice and tight for a good few seconds. The bond is going to take quite a while to go solid. I would usually leave it for 5 minutes, then just add a couple more drops so it wicks into any gaps, and then massage the plastic to get it all moving. Then leave it for a few hours to fully harden. And here we are sometime later at step 75, where we've got seats, which is more paint and glue, so we're going to have to skip those for the time being. Step 76, fitting the cab to the chassis. Also, there's some bits like the windscreen wipers and the front handles, but they're going to go on after the paint. We can fit the cab to the chassis though, so we're going to need 2 M3x6 cap heads, 2 3x12 self-tappers, the big metal plate, and T6 the spacer block. We're also going to need the chassis, so we've got somewhere to fit it. Right, at the back of the cab we have the slot we fitted earlier that fits over the tongue on the back of the electronics plate on the chassis. Right now it's really quite easy to do, but once you've got loads of wires running around it's going to be a bit tricky to get it in position without trapping something. Routing all the wires is going to need a little bit of thought to make it all work nice and smoothly. At the front of the cab it's attached with the 2 cap heads that thread straight into the metal bracket on the chassis. A bit further down we need to line up the block and metal plate so the holes line up, and we use the 2 self-tappers to attach it to the front of the chassis. Nip them up and that's bag J as complete as we're going to get it. Obviously there's still quite a lot to do to the cab, but that's as far as we can go with a dry build. When we get to it we can work out wire routing, see if we need to drill any holes and modify parts. It does add quite a bit of time to the build doing it this way, but overall it's easier than trying to modify a part that's already been painted. The next parts bag is a bit of an epic, building all the rear boxes and adding the lower skirts. I think we should be able to squeeze it into one video, but there is quite a lot to get through. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!